Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Jared Reid.
This week, we are taking a closer look at the fact that Australia has become the first country in the world to ban social media from children under the age of 16. This is going to impact social media platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, you name it. So the question is, will this be successful and will other countries follow suit? Is this a successful push against big tech? And how did Australia even manage to pass this legislation?
That's right. And in a few moments, we're going to be speaking to two experts about this. It's going to be a big old g'day to Cam Wilson. He's a tech journalist at Australia's Crikey Media. And a bit later, Kate Clonick, a professor at St John's University School of Law in New York. She'll be talking to us about the bigger global picture in this battle against big tech. And as usual, we have Cherry Chan in the chat. She's going to be monitoring your questions and comments and feeding them over to me, and I'll bring them into the discussion. You'll also see a poll question that is up there in the chat. We'd really appreciate your participation in that. And some of you have already been weighing in on our community post that went live yesterday. Thank you so much for that. I'll read out a couple of comments. Anwar says that this ban, it's about time. These companies are ruining the minds of entire generations. JD has a different opinion, says the government shouldn't be involved and that parents need to act like parents. Todd says he thinks this is good. He says now do the same for boomers. They are even more susceptible to believing in random nonsense on the internet than any other age group. So
really good point.
Interesting point of view there.
Well, I mean, Jared, you are from Australia. Have you been talking to friends or family members and have they said anything about this piece of legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone is talking about this. I've been speaking to a couple of teachers and parents. So one teacher told me that she thought it was really, really good based on observations from her classroom. Another teacher I know, she teaches children with teenagers with special needs, and she was quite critical and said this was like taking away the landline phone that we used in the 90s, and this was kind of today's version of that, simply because kids use social media to form a sense of community. She was worried about what this might mean for more vulnerable teenagers who don't have a big group of people around them. I've been speaking to parents as well, and I think some parents are quite happy with it. They think it's a good idea, and certainly the parents I was speaking to think that as well. They're a bit sceptical as to how it's going to work, but one parent said to me, well, even if it doesn't work, at least the world is talking about this now. And she says this is probably going to give parents and platforms a good kick up the backside. Also, another parent said that her son wasn't interested in social media, didn't have a social media account. He's 16, but he was interested in hacks and how to get around things. Okay. So she was waiting to see whether her son was going to try and at least try and attempt to get onto the platforms, which we've been hearing some teenagers trying to do.
And of course, this is going to have ramifications around the world. A lot of other countries are looking at what Australia is doing and are going to assess whether they should pass legislation of our own. If you're just joining us, a reminder of our topic. The title is Protecting Teens from Big Tech, Australia's Social Media Crackdown. Is it censorship or protection or what else? So let's dive right into this and welcome Cam Wilson from Crikey Media and Kate Clonick from St John's University. Thank you to both of you. Cam especially is joining us from Sydney, and I believe it is 1 a.m. there. So we are incredibly grateful that you're joining us.
What a trooper. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks for having me. You know, it's really, we're all at battle stations here, so yeah, no problem to be up, and it's this hour.
Okay, well, we are very grateful. I'm going to start with a series of questions for you, since you are in Australia. And Kate, we ask for your patience for this part as we get through some of the basics. And first of all, I'm going to run a soundbite from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese of Australia. This is something that is addressed to the young people who will be impacted. Have a listen.
It's the Prime Minister here, and I wanted to speak to you directly about something very important. From December 10, if you're under 16, you're no longer allowed to have a social media account. You'll know better than anyone what it's like growing up with algorithms, endless speeds, and the pressure that can come with that. That's why we've taken this step to support you. Above all, make the most of the school holidays coming up, rather than spending it scrolling on your phone. Start a new sport, learn a new instrument, or read that book that has been sitting there on your shelf for some time. And importantly, spend quality time with your friends and your family, face to face.
All right, so the Prime Minister there essentially telling the kids to touch grass. Cam, what is actually happening and what does a ban mean? How is it supposed to work?
Sure. So the teen social media ban was passed into law about a year ago after about a 6-month campaign. And what it is actually doing is really two things. The first thing is that it is raising the minimum age of social media platforms from 13 to 16. In most, for the most of the major platforms around the world, they kind of have an industry standard de facto age of about 13. That's actually really based off US laws, but it's kind of become the standard around the world. The second half of it is actually making those companies enforce it, because one of the things that has been the kind of dirty little secret of the industry, I would say for the last 10 or 15 years, is that while they do have minimum ages, many people will be familiar about the lengths to which you have to go to prove your age in the past, which was not exactly much. You would say, what's your age? You'd put it into a little box, and it was pretty much the honesty system. You know, they believed you based on what you told them. This law now says that companies need to take reasonable steps to stop children under 16 from having accounts on their platforms. It's not enough just to rely on that honesty system anymore. And so as a result, we're seeing the introduction of things like seeing platforms scan the faces of users, even asking them to upload IDs, connect to their bank account to prove their age if the platform has reason to suspect that they are under 16.
Why is this happening now? Why has this administration taken up the case so seriously?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I think you can really trace the roots of this whole thing back to the COVID-19 pandemic, when particularly in Australia, we were very locked down, and around the world, you know, everyone kind of retreated from the real world, and so much of our lives went into the digital realm. And for a lot of parents, I've heard from politicians for years and years that they've been hearing concerns from these parents saying they felt uncomfortable about the habits of their children. You know, children were taken out of school, school went digital. And from there, I think there's been this real feeling, you know, in a lot of people that they feel uncomfortable perhaps about their own technology use, but particularly children. But particularly with this law, it all started about 18 months ago when the Prime Minister was asked on a radio show hosted by a guy who just launched a group calling for the minimum age of social media to be raised from 13 to 16. He was on a radio show in May and he said, I support the campaign. And from there, it was 6 months between him saying, I'm into this, you know, no commitment further than that, into him shepherding the law, you know, through the governing processes until it passed Parliament. Then there was a 12-month kind of lead-in for the platforms to work with the government to work on the policy, to get the details of how the ban would actually work after they'd passed the law, to say, this is actually what you've got to do. So that now, we've reached now December 10. It is the deadline for all the platforms to have to start taking those reasonable steps. And we're seeing how all the platforms are doing that, how teens are reacting. And as the first day today in Australia, there was quite a lot going on. There was a lot of coverage of the kind of stumbles and mishaps of the platform. And the government has been saying, you know, this is early days. We don't expect it to be perfect. This is the start of something new. It's going to get better from here.
So do you think this legislation will succeed, and what do you think that success would look like? And I'm going to play the second soundbite from the Prime Minister in terms of how he defines success. Let's have a listen to that.
It won't be perfect because this is a big change. But I've been asked this morning in media interviews, what will success look like? Success is the fact that it's happening. Success is the fact that we're having this discussion. Parents are talking to their children around the breakfast table.
So I guess, my question to you, Cam, is what is your take on what success looks like? Regardless of what the Prime Minister says, you've been a tech journalist reporting for Crikey Media on this issue for so long. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, I think my take on it is a little bit different to the Prime Minister, and I think the Prime Minister's version of what success is has changed drastically even over the 12 months between the law coming into being passed and it coming into effect. What this was originally sold as doing was helping, the Prime Minister initially said, social media is causing social harm and we want to stop that social harm. Over the 12 months, I think it's kind of evolved, but really this law has been about this idea that these major social media platforms have features and designs that encourage people to have bad experiences, that it affects their mental health, that it keeps them up all night, it disrupts their sleep, it facilitates bullying, all the kind of social ills that are facilitated online, and they don't do enough to stop that. In many cases, they make these issues worse by, getting people addicted to this. So in terms of success, if you think going back to that, you'd want to see the well-being of young people improve. I think conversations are great. We love having conversations, consciously thinking about all this stuff. But really, I think what people are looking at, and in fact, what we know parts of the government are looking at, despite the Prime Minister setting the bar, I would say, quite low, is there is actually a kind of longitudinal study being conducted by one part of the government, looking at all kinds of things that are happening to children, both before the ban and after the ban, to understand its effect. So, it's going to look at everything from medication rates, going to look at screen time. It's even, I think, got to look at how happy they are, all kinds of things, and we'll look at the amount of circumvention as well, because what I alluded to before when I was saying that it was a bit of a day of stumbles, the dominant story of today in Australian media was that this happened and that many of the teens were able to get around it, whether they kind of convinced the platforms that they were older because they scrunched up their face to look at they had wrinkles, or put on makeups, or maybe even got a friend to do it, or maybe they got their parents' ID. But a really big story today was that these systems that the government were requiring these platforms to set up weren't doing a really great job at keeping younger people out. That will be one of the things that we kind of look at to understand how well this law works because of its implementation.
And of course, proponents would say even if 80% of young people can circumvent it, if you have 20% fewer people being able to access this, that's still a win. But I would love to bring in Kate at this time. Kate, thank you so much for your patience. Countries around the world have tried to set up guardrails against various aspects of big tech. I'd love your take on what Australia has done.
Yeah, we've been watching. Australia has been kind of one of the leaders in social media regulation around the world for years, alongside kind of Europe, but particularly the interventions around youth and age assurance laws in social media have been at the fore. And this particular law, yes, people in the US are talking about it, not a huge amount, I think, but there has been some coverage of it just because of the drastic kind of nature of, a real ban on everyone under 16 of all social media. Kind of the lack of half measure creates a strong A/B test, or is seen as creating a strong A/B test between countries. We can unpack that and whether it will be a strong A/B test in a little bit. I think that a lot of that was brought up in kind of what your last questions were just a second ago. But I think that this is going to be a very interesting experiment, and I'm really questioning whether or not it's going to be a good experiment, I guess, and that normative question is a hard one to kind of dig into, because what good is and what success is are very difficult questions, and they're culturally dependent, obviously.
And Cam talked a little bit about the challenges, but Kate, what do you think would be the challenges for enforcing this legislation? And then we'll go to Jared next. I'll check in with Jared after to see if there are any questions and comments from the chat. But Kate, over to you.
Yeah, I think that there is an illusion that people have about the veracity and the ability to determine age online. I think that people think that computers can have magical intuitions about what your age is and can do either facial recognition scans or you present an ID and that's enough. But people have been getting around age verification schemes. Children have been getting around age verification schemes for as long as time has created them and the laws have created them. Fake IDs are just as just as pliable online as they are at like your local bar. And there is going to be plenty of ways that people kind of get around these laws. So that's one thing. And the trade-offs that people kind of increasingly talk about with age assurance, things like behavioral tracking of children to try to determine how old they are, things like facial recognition scans, come with like other trade-offs that we are also concerned about for children and talking about actively, which are like huge privacy invasive problems. And we're just kind of carte blanche signing over our children's data and our children's faces to these companies in order to do these age scans because we've decided for not great reasons that are completely clear that just like a 16-year-old limit is the age and the place it to make this kind of determination. So I mean, there just are a lot of trade-offs, and this idea, I had to kind of laugh. I had not heard the Prime Minister's clip of just like what will success look like, and success will look like it happens is like one of the like I'm like, what is even happening? Like I don't even understand. It's just like okay, you passed the law. It's kind of it will happen. Like something will happen, or nothing will happen but something will still happen. I mean, it's a very, we're trying to kind of, I hope that we have a little bit more of an empirical and rigorous kind of process in place around judging the success of something as profound as kind of taking away or infringing on the privacy and the freedom of like even 16-year-olds who are people and have rights as well.
I want to talk a little bit more about that because there seems to be that dichotomy or tension between parental rights versus people who care very much about digital rights and this law. So we'll get to that and expound on it. But meanwhile, I want to check in with Jared to see if there are any questions from people in the chat.
Yeah, we're having there's a bit of discussion as we've been talking about as to what defines success, and there are varying opinions of that. Nilay's written, it's understandable that this is not going to work 100%, but even if a third or half of kids can be protected, the law would have done its job, and I guess we're going to talk about if the law can do its job. But the question for Cam, the government's arguing that this law is going to safeguard the mental well-being and the mental health of young people. And we're just wondering, possibly if you know what the government is basing that on, and if you can also maybe give us a picture of the picture of teenage mental health in Australia currently.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's lovely to hear an Australian accent as well. I mean, look, I think the mental health aspect of it is so interesting because it has really been a large part of this, and all of Australia has heard some really, really awful stories about people who've lost kids and said that social media was the cause of that it facilitated it through things like cyberbullying or worsening problems with body image and that kind of thing. So people are very aware of hearing these stories. When we get into the more kind of nuanced and complicated questions about the influence and impact of social media on Australian teens, when you start speaking to the people who kind of work in the sector, who spent a long time in it, who are experts, I would say that there weren't many, if any, major mental health organisations in Australia that supported the ban before it happens. That's not to say that they didn't support something being done to change social media. Like, I think there is a pretty wide consensus that people feel uncomfortable about what social media is doing to people generally, and particularly young people. But the idea of a ban, which is a very blunt kind of method, as was mentioned just before, versus a variety of other reforms that are out there, or in fact actually were kind of already underway through a less glamorous regulatory means that were happening, meant that these groups weren't really full-throatedly endorsing it happening. And now that it has happened, they've kind of like gotten on board to be like, we're producing guides and trying to help people then transition. But, you know, in terms of what it is like to be a young person in Australia, I mean, it is such a varied thing. And I think this gets to one of the core tensions of this policy and really of all policy making, right? Which is that you often need to make a decision about a rule that applies to everyone and how social media affects people. We know from research affects people in very different ways depending on who you are. You might be someone who is, has a great support network, who just spends too long on time, who falls into those problems of social media that many of us would be familiar with, too long scrolling, being distracted, all those kinds of things, seeing push notifications and not doing your work. And so maybe that's beneficial for them to get off that. But then there's also people out there who maybe don't have their support networks, maybe don't go to school or have a poor attendance, maybe don't have a great relationship with their family. Maybe they're in a regional area and they're vulnerable for other means. They don't know people who live around them with similar identities. For all those reasons, social media and the connection that it brings, the information and way to understand yourself and your identity might be a lot more valuable. So you can see how generalizing is so difficult. And I think that question really gets to the core of why this has been such a contentious issue, particularly when you kind of get down to the experts who are spending all their time thinking about this, saying, how do you balance up these different demands and also risks?
Kate, I see you nodding along. Before we go to you, I want to actually play a clip because, Cam, you were talking about this being such an emotional issue and that in media, parents who've had children negatively impacted have come out to talk about it and blame social media when potentially the research might show that it's a complicated mixture of what impacted their child. But here's the case of Emma Mason, a mother who's very tragically, her daughter killed herself, and she blamed it squarely on social media. And I'm just going to play a clip because this was, I believe, at the UN General Assembly on the sidelines of that for a special event. But that's the kind of thing that makes it a global issue. Take a listen.
Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, they all played their deadly part. Of course, Tilly's pain was over, but for everyone who loved her, our daily pain never ends. Tilly died from 1,000 cuts that occurred in the course of her short life. The bullying started in primary school and it moved from face-to-face to social media, and the harm was swift. From not being invited to parties that everyone is at, only to have girls ring, message and taunt her all night long, to harassment and bullying via social media.
Kate, it's just so heartbreaking when you see this stuff with parents, and we know there's been multiple cases around the world where this happens, and then parents come out and talk about the fact that their child was spending so much time on social media. So it's very natural for them to blame that. Earlier, you were talking about the fact that there's so much research being done in terms of mental health, but also, as a result, how that might feed into sound legislation. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I just want to say that was a very touching clip, and I think that it is a resonant thing. And there's a reason that those types of anecdotes and everything have moved legislation forward and have moved regulation forward, because it's a very profound and incredibly terrifying thing for all parents to think about losing kind of control of their relationship with their child, or not knowing how to address the harms that their child is facing from something like social media or something like bullying in a school. But again, there was something that she said at the beginning here, and it moved from face to face to social media. And there's no doubt that social media creates a complex kind of and difficult augmented and magnified relationship with bullying. It just feels, from the perspective of the person who is bullied, much greater. It feels like you are just being targeted by everyone. The likes, the everyone's hanging out without me, the fear of being left out, all of that is very, very real. So I don't want to minimize that at all. But again, the answer to that is not necessarily. It also sounds like just a terrible school environment. It sounds like these other children were terrible and were not being properly parented. It sounds like, that there was no type of response or other types of levers to kind of like to alert people that this situation had gotten so out of control. So I'm not going to say like at all, and I don't think it would be realistic to say that like social media doesn't contribute and magnify these types of things, but it is far from like the but for cause of something like awful like this happening, right? And there is no way to measure and know the but for cause, even in tragic situations like this. And I understand the desire of a parent, obviously, as one, or like as one, and like, and I think anyone, whenever it's a very human instinct to find the reason something terrible happened to you and then try to fix it. Like we do this in every situation. It is the role that blame plays in society and punishment kind of plays in society. But this is not actually like a ban on social media under 16 is not clear that this would save lives. And for the exact reason that Cam kind of just explained, and I think he said like so eloquently, which is that like there might be just as many kids who are isolated from people that are like them, people that look like them, people that act like them, that they can identify with. I like use the example of like the queer kid in Tennessee, the Black kid in the middle of Oklahoma, like in like the United States. These are places that are just not particularly diverse. And having a decentralized internet community, having places where people can find other people that talk, look, act, feel like them, normalizes their experience and gives them hope to get out of high school, right? Like can actually save lives, that you can like identify and find communities and understand in a really visceral sense that it gets better, right? That it gets better and that you can move past these really hard experiences in your life. And so I'm like, well, I'm incredibly touched about that story. And like, I work on social harms of social media, but I work on trying to find nuanced actual solutions that do measure success, because I think often what does happen is that you have a tragic situation like this, and the way the politicians and governments respond is to give you an out of the box, one size fits all solution that actually doesn't address the things that we're most concerned with, because these are complicated questions. And so it's not that like I'm necessarily against a ban. I just feel like there's absolutely no way that we could, and it's not intuitive to me at all, that a ban is the way to save more kids' lives. Like that actually seems just as likely, frankly, to like cause more children to feel isolated from other people in their communities. And kids were committing suicide, unfortunately, before social media existed. So this is really, truly kind of one of these moments where I just really feel as if I wish we were having more of a conversation about the complex nature of these problems if we care about them so much, and not just kind of slapping a restriction on something and hoping that things get better, and that they will, no more kids will kill themselves if we ban social media.
We're getting a lot of responses in the chat about a lot of support behind this, and you were talking about whether the goal or not is to save lives. People are asking, well, what if the goal instead is to give kids a better online, safer experience? Whether that instead was the goal, and if saving lives would be something that would be great to have, but instead giving kids a safer online experience. What are your thoughts on that, Kate?
Yeah, and I think that cars are always a dangerous example, because cars aren't speech and cars aren't privacy. That both of those things complicate the issues around social media. But I guess I use cars as an example to compare to social media, because you have a new technology and you have something that's incredibly dangerous. A lot of people die at the onset and the widespread uptake of driving, and there are not basic things that are in place to make it safe. There aren't seatbelts, there aren't car seats, there are like a lot of things that need to be developed and people need to understand that need to happen. And regulation is a part of that, but people didn't ban cars. They did set age limits for when you could drive and how you could and actually teaching you how to drive, having courses and things like that. But there are certain types of they're not outright kinds of bans on in the same way that kind of speech and privacy are. And the development, I think, in my personal opinion, of kind of we have a generational gap in which parents are parenting children with technologies that they never themselves used or had any type of normalcy on. And so there had been no development of norms on what was safe, what was effective. The platforms didn't understand yet, or if they did, they weren't instituting the restrictions, what was safe and what wasn't. And that's changed fairly rapidly, but there is a generation that has unfortunately suffered outsized effects, in my opinion, of kind of the harm of social media. But that doesn't mean that we can't do better without completely just like getting rid of this entirely. And again, I do want to kind of point out that even though people say cars, well, we don't let people drive cars under 16, these are different types of expressive technologies, and they are much more nuanced and different and have kind of far less dramatic effects than, driving a phone into a telephone pole or something, or driving a car into a telephone pole. So like there are limits that essentially have to be put into place. And also, I just wanted to say that like one of the really important parts about becoming a member of society is like learning how to interact with these technologies and not just having this complete kind of memory holding of them or making them forbidden and then introducing them at 16 without any type of like understanding of limits or how these things work or what good behavior looks like and modeling that.
Got it. Cam, I would love for you, I have a question for you, but if you want to respond or follow up on anything that Kate has said, I also want to give you the opportunity now before I dive straight in.
Oh, I mean, I would just say that, I think there's a kind of variety of reforms out there that people are thinking about when we talk about this. And so that's kind of always what I feel like we should keep in the conversation when we've been talking about the ban and what other countries might want to do, which is like sometimes the debate gets set up in this binary. Either we ban kids from social media or we do nothing. But that's not what it is. That's not really the options that we have. We do have a lot of options, and perhaps we do need to do radical, drastic things that we haven't really done before. And when you hear people talking, when you hear about the government talking about the bits of the social media that they think are bad, the gamified features that keep people on there too long, the recommendation engines, these kinds of things, those are things that you can actually do something about if you pass a law, if you pass regulation. The things that we are talking about saying that is kind of that we want to keep, that we're losing the ban, the idea of using technology to connect with other people, if you kind of act on the bits that you don't like, perhaps you can keep some of that benefit of the things that you do like. Because, I mean, fundamentally, I think one of the criticisms of this law is that it is completely blanket. It says social media is bad. And, no matter what you do, no matter if all these platforms in the background completely reform them, got rid of all the harmful features, it would still be the law. There's no incentive to actually make the better features. Maybe we should try and create an incentive structure. Maybe we should pass laws and regulations that make or encourage these companies to produce versions of these applications that we think are more acceptable, or somehow encourage alternatives that do this. That has kind of been my kind of like issue with the ban as a concept, and that's the kind of prism through which I think about looking at the ban critically.
Do you think that, is there already talk of further legislation that will hone or refine or add on top of what has just happened in Australia? That's to Cam.
Yeah, so for a while there, we've been talking about following some other places and doing a digital duty of care. This is a policy that essentially, the best way of kind of putting it, is that it puts a proactive onus on these companies to consider the potential risks and harms of their platforms and get them to mitigate it before we actually do anything about it. You know, no need to pass a law. We're saying you guys need to think about what you're doing with your platforms, how it's affecting users, and make sure that you are not causing harms. And that's this idea again of we're not banning it. You know, we're not saying you can't do these things. In fact, it's actually quite a kind of, you know, it's a flexible, and maybe a critique of it is a kind of vaguer regulation, but it's one that's saying, you know, we don't have to be super prescriptive. We don't have to be, you know, super broad. We just put a kind of obligation on you to do something. The government has actually already committed to doing something like that. It's consulting on that at the moment. It says it's going to pass something like that. So that is, as you can see, at the same time, we've got, you know, there's one policy that's this broad policy, but there's another one that, you know, presents a different option that, unfortunately, though, with the ban won't actually apply to teens because they won't be on these platforms, even if they do have that digital duty of care.
Cam, I'm also curious about big tech's response. That these are multinational corporations whose annual revenues are larger than the GDPs of many countries in the world. There's a real potential here in terms of retaliation, pushback, pressure, and also we've seen that actually with the way U.S. President Donald Trump has flexed in terms of putting pressure on the European Union on another set of sort of guardrails that the European Union has on big tech. Could there be retaliation from the United States government?
I mean, there could be. I unfortunately don't have the ear of Donald Trump, so I can't give you any breaking news on that. But what I can say is that very clearly, I mean, the platforms, the tech companies behind the platforms have raised issues with this throughout the process. They have really kind of focused on this idea that it's an unworkable concept or that it's flawed, and that, you know, in fact, many of the problems that I spoke about before that are happening, they've kind of said these are things that were going to come up, and so for that reason, we shouldn't have to do this policy. But despite you know, fears of tech companies, you know, withdrawing their services, malicious compliance, like all the kind of, you know, potential, I guess, not complying at all. The major tech companies that were said that were definitely in the ban have all complied. So, you know, come December 10, despite, you know, there was a bit of drama in the middle, they're all actually doing what they're supposed to be doing to some extent. But that's not to say there's no challenges to this. In fact, there is actually already a High Court challenge that has been filed against the law that's saying that this law it restricts the Australians' freedom of political expression, and that it does so in a way that is overly burdensome and isn't worth the kind of benefits. And that's kind of has been introduced by a small, in fact, previously unknown group that is associated with a small libertarian politician. But today we actually heard that Reddit reportedly is considering joining this. So at this, and for a long time, there has been speculation that Google will as well, and that's still on the cards. So we're kind of seeing this thing where these platforms are playing along. They are abiding by the law. They clearly have issues with it, but they may also use every avenue, including the legal avenues, to challenge it, whether it's to challenge their inclusion in it or the fact that the law itself is completely unfair according to the rules of the land.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was wondering if there are threats of retaliation or of somehow. I mean, I think of a case in Canada with Google and Google threatening just to not make itself available in all of Canada if the Canadian government was to pass this legislation. So that kind of thing, sort of really ratcheting up the tension and putting pressure on the Australian government on this. So if you have any additional thoughts on that, I'd be very curious.
Just quickly, I would say that in fact, I think actually Australia was first on this. We actually had Facebook temporarily withdraw news from us, I think first in 2021 when we passed a law that meant that two, specifically Google and Meta, had to pay Australian news publishers, and that was worth I think close to $100 million a year in terms of money that was going directly from these platforms to news publishers. And for a while in negotiations, Facebook actually pulled news. So there is kind of precedent for that. I think to put it in perspective, yes, losing users is obviously a problem. Yes, it is spreading around the world. I imagine these companies are very concerned about because it adds to their regulatory costs, it adds to their operational costs. It's a big issue. And obviously they don't want to create creating spaces for other social media companies to first get younger users and then potentially challenge them in the future. But to put it in perspective, there's a few other actually interesting Australian tech things that I won't go into, including the second version of that law that I mentioned before that put money towards news publishers, that actually might be an even bigger a kind of burden on these tech companies' bottom line. So I think when they're thinking about the nuclear option, this ban doesn't seem to be the one that they're thinking about, pressing the big red button on. It might be something else.
Got it. Kate, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I think that I just wanted to kind of flag this as like this isn't actually new. I mean, the Australia actually, and it was one of the more high profile examples post news ban where Facebook kind of shut down in Australia around that law. But this has been happening for forever. The decisions for there to be geo-blocking within a country for various types of restrictions by the platforms has been happening since the early days of the internet. And it goes both ways. Pakistan will shut off Facebook for failing to, take down pictures of two men kissing. There's lots of, so there's actually a much more complicated kind of cat and mouse game between private platforms who both have like obvious kind of capitalistic incentives to push their platform and their content to places and to get engagement and everything else, but also have kind of genuine free speech concerns in some contexts, as being kind of providing a service that is kind of based in liberty and kind of and speech and expression to individuals, and how far it is that they will push the censorship regimes of governments on their users. And for better or for worse, a lot of these tech companies, everything basically besides TikTok, are based in the United States, are based in United States norms around freedom of expression that are extremely, extremely, I would say the people both that work there and like their intuitions around a lot of this stuff is that and a lot of their base policies and how they came up are against government regulation of private speech. And that comes both in the speech and how, like, whether you consider the algorithm speech, whether you consider certain types of expression and the content moderation rules of how these platforms decide to market themselves as speech, that there is, nonetheless, there is user speech that is happening on these platforms, and that there's a danger in them just bending the knee to every government who tells them exactly what that should look like. And so this is kind of an ongoing geopolitical debate also, as kind of governments become aware in the last 25 years that like controlling content moderation, controlling what you see online is also a great political and propagandistic tool. And so I just kind of want to is like, there are lots and lots of motivations here by government to regulate speech. Some of them are good in theory, and some of them are just obviously nefarious or corrupt or kind of against, various Western democratic values. And those are things that the platforms are kind of grappling with as they decide how to comply with these laws. And, increasingly it's a bottom line question of like, is this going to be cheaper for our business to face these potential fines and do all of this compliance work? And for really large companies, the answer is yes, it is cheaper. For smaller companies, that's not always the right answer. And that does mean more entrenchment of giant global players. And people are kind of not talking about that type of reality that's setting in without us kind of thinking that it's great that we're kind of like proliferating all of this regulation, but not realizing how it's like making another problem worse at the same time.
Thank you very much, Kate. Cam, I'm well aware of how late it is over there, so I actually want to give you a final check in with you if you have any final thoughts and let you get going a little earlier.
Look, I would just say that, I think one of the parts of the debate that has actually disappointed me is that I think that there has not been enough heard from kids directly. I think there's been a lot of conversations about kids and what's kind of best for them, but very often their voices haven't been heard in this. And the relationship between parents and kids and even kids in the state, and how we as a society decide, of course kids will want all kinds of things and we don't always give everything they want, but to what extent we respect their autonomy and their desires is a very complicated question. But the thing that I kind of have just been finding amusing is in this last 24 hours, when we've seen the ban come into effect and when we've seen kids in just the most creative and interesting ways and fun ways get around the ban, celebrate getting around the ban. One of the things that's happened over the last day is that in the kind of comment sections of the Prime Minister's TikTok and Facebook account, it's filled with teens who've gone around the bans bragging about how they're there and saying, take that to the Prime Minister. And I just think it's a glorious thing to see. I think the kind of creativity, the connection of kids that you say is like the best parts of social media, the things that you want them to be doing, not like just passively consuming and, I don't know, being like radicalized towards something, but, expressing themselves, mobilizing, thinking about political things and being part of a broader conversation. So, I mean, look, it's a silver lining that I think in this moment we've actually seen the kind of exercise in some ways, some of the best of young people being online and as well, in the Australian tradition where we are, it's kind of, we're a larrikin country, we believe in kind of, talking the same to everyone and not treating, people as like high status to be different, to be able to talk back, to be able to essentially troll the Prime Minister is very Australian, and it makes me in a way very proud to see them do that.
All right. Well, Cam Wilson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you.
And Kate, if you can stick around a little bit, I have some questions for you about the bigger picture around the world. But since Cam mentioned the voices of young people, we did clip up some voices and opinions of young Australian teens. So let's roll that and see what they have to say.
It's going to be worse for like queer people and like people with like niche interests, I guess. Online you find more people that like understand you and they just like get you more.
I actually, weirdly enough, think it's good because there's other apps like WhatsApp which you can use to text people, and it like stops you from getting distracted from learning.
Well, probably be good for our mental health, like our screen time will go down.
And are you guys already on social media?
No, we're not allowed.
So there you go. That's the voice from the children, so to speak. And also, before I have a bunch of questions for Kate, but Sherry, I know you've been tapping away, and I was seeing you pretty busy there. I wanted to check in with you and what you're seeing.
We have very lively debate in our chat.
That's great.
People have all different kinds of opinion. It's quite polarizing, but it's also quite interesting to see how what people think about this. Just when we were talking about kids, we have Davos, one of our longtime viewer, who says that he thinks kids are very smart, and in his experience that like kids are intelligent and they can distinguish what's harmful for them. And he was impressed with some of the conversations he had with kids. So he was quite against this ban. But there also are the people who are saying, giving these examples, which I think is quite interesting. He says, rule, I assume it's him. This user said, children are protected from many other addictive stuff like alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. And it is absurd to even consider it censorship as if we were discussing rights for adults. And I think this is quite interesting. Just not to forget, we also have a poll for all of you. I'm going to read out the poll question now in case you haven't seen it. So we're asking, will Australia's social media ban work? The 4 options are yes, it's a good first step. Maybe, but kids will get around it. No, tech firms will sabotage it, or it's pointless. So remember to vote, and I will tell you the result we have later.
Cool.
Kate, Sherry just mentioned tobacco there, and there has been this analogy that this is the modern day big tobacco moment. Is that a sensible analogy in your opinion?
I mean, no. I mean, there's just not. I mean, I think that it's a non-starter to say something like that speech and speech products and privacy concerns are equivalent to a commercial product like tobacco or alcohol. These are just, those are like actual kind of measurable health effects. They have, the drawing lines around them don't like invoke like human rights principles in the same way that and like I would just have to disagree with kind of the commenter who just says that like, well, it's ridiculous that we treat any allow like this is a censorship issue. And I'm like, why isn't it a censorship issue? There's like, these are imaginary lines that we draw around kind of ideas of the age of majority and the age of minority. They are just things that we have like kind of like, whimsically and without a lot of science base around them, determined ages at which we think people are good at making risk assessments, people are going to be held accountable for their actions, people are going to be able to march off to war and be drafted. Like, these are all issues that we have like kind of just arbitrarily picked lines. Then there's a recent really huge longitudinal study that came out just today about kind of different age like kind of gaps, and there has long been an understanding in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience the 26-year-old brains is the point at which kind of risk assessment finally materializes. And now that line is getting moved out to 33. So like, what is like Australia's new social media ban going to be on everyone under age 26? Of course it's not. But like, there is this just kind of like, I don't know why a 16-year-old doesn't have a right to consume knowledge or participate in a political process, or a 15-year-old doesn't, and a 16-year-old does. That seems like completely arbitrary to me, and different than having the right to smoke a cigarette in a really fundamental way for democracy.
I mean, I guess my question or kind of pushback is human rights. I think we tend to think of it as a free speech issue, but there's also, of course, grounded in human rights, the right to health. And so maybe that analogy is closer than, there's an argument that the analogy is not as disparate as the way you've presented.
Yeah, I mean, there are rights to health, there's rights to liberty. Like, you could make the same kind of argument that like kind of having some type of right with like cigarettes is like around like kind of like your individual liberty. But I just think that in the case of cigarettes, for example, that there is a much brighter line, and there was much more evidence-based science around kind of the dangers of that. We don't have anything close to that for social media. And it's a much more complicated question. And so again, the outright ban on this is not necessarily going to have the effects of like banning cigarettes. And so I just think that there are certain types of things that you can measure, and that the social media effects are not necessarily kind of the unequivocal unhealthy behavior that you could kind of like say about cigarettes, for example. I mean, the kid the people that were interviewed just were talking about how they've found friends and community online that's made their lives better. So it's like there's just all kinds of reactions, and they're so diverse and so kind of potentially beneficial that there is no way of knowing what exactly the effects of a ban are going to have.
Interesting. Jared, did you have something?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, slightly off topic, but it's about the ability of teenagers under the age of 16 to think critically, and if this potentially could change, this ban localised at the moment in Australia, does it have the potential to affect how teenagers think and process information critically?
Just the effects of the ban, like, are they going to have less information to kind of think critically on and train on, essentially, by like just being kind of cut off from this?
Yeah.
Kind of in a way that like people think that it's really bad to like just completely ban TV from kids.
Exactly.
And they're not going to have exposure to that. Yeah. I mean, yes, you can make the exact same argument to like kind of the idea that like, you can, all of us, I think, maybe know parents who decided to never let their kids watch TV, and they like kind of turned out fine. And they kind and they're like, they have various types of, there are like gaps in their knowledge culturally or things like that. But I think that that's a general rule, that there's like, that those are individual decisions that people can make also. And there are trade-offs, like, right? Like a lot of people don't have certain types of access and certain types of knowledge, and don't have the ability to have never developed the skills to limit themselves on television, or to understand what was like good or bad to watch, or how to kind of assess the accuracy of news media or things like that, because they weren't doing it from a younger age. So yes, of course, there are like a very large amount of kind of secondary or tertiary effects, that just the challenge of deciding for yourself and going through the hardship of like, this isn't so good for me. Maybe I'm spending too much time on Twitter. Maybe I'm spending too much time on Snapchat. Maybe this isn't making me feel good, is like, a very like robust thing that you should do as like a person growing up, and learn how to manage for yourself rather than having the state do it for you.
It's interesting you saying that. Just reminds me of my own growing up with my parents being super strict with me about what I couldn't watch on TV, which was basically everything. And then my brother and sister came along and it was very different for them. So, yeah.
Well, my analogy is that I got the Nintendo game console and I started playing hours on it every day. And then one day I just couldn't find it anymore. My mother had taken it away in the closet. And that actually did work for me. I stopped playing games and I started studying again. But these are not perfect analogies, like you said. Is not related to this free speech issue that you said. Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Well, I do think that I think that what you're raising is like that these are institutional. Like there's a question, and like we use in the law, like these are institutional capacity issues. At what point in a child's life should the state versus a parent versus a school versus a local government versus whatever else be making these decisions for children? And I think that one of the reasons parents want this law is because it takes them off the hook for doing a lot of parenting. And so like, that's fine. But like, there's other ways to do that. There's ways that we could build the technology so that it makes it easier on parents to say no, or to not say no, to let their kids, on social media. But I just think that like, again, the breadth and the absolute kind of the breadth and the of a ban is just such a harsh, kind of very blunt instrument. And I just, listening to the prime minister talk about go ride a bike, it was just kind of like, I was like, oh man, like what would my reaction to this be if I was 14? I mean, my reaction to it at like 41 is like, man, screw this guy. I don't care what he thinks I should be doing. Like, and so, who knows that the next brilliant video game developer, cinematographer, or whatever else isn't developing right now because they have access to their Nintendo, right? And so like, you have no idea like what the world is going to look like or what you're going to put out there because you expose someone to that, and they don't have to sit around and just like ride a bike up and down their dead end street, So there is something to kind of be said for kind of this really kind of, I think, ill-considered kind of one-size-fits-all solution.
So we spent a lot of time talking about sort of the ethics of it and the research behind mental health and its connection to social media and young people. Kate, I want to ask you what other countries have been doing in terms of trying to regulate social media that you think would be very interesting for people to know, and possibly if there are any that you find interesting and effective.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the EU has for a while been working on, they passed recently digital social, the
Digital Services
the DSA.
Act. Yeah.
The Digital Services Act, thank you. The Digital Services Act, that is starting to go into effect just this week. They passed a bunch of things, but that is not specifically related to children in particular. Individual member states in the EU are passing their own laws around this. All of them are struggling with kind of the lines around enforcement, at what point in kind of the internet stack that type of age verification could and is best placed. Like, is it best placed in app stores about like kind of determining how or is it best placed at the platform level? Is it best placed at the parental level? Things like that, and parental controls. And so all of these things are happening everywhere. In the United States, they're happening very much at the state level right now because of a lack of kind of federal movement and our Congress kind of being a little bit stymied. You might have heard about that at the moment. And so there's but they're happening at the state level. And so you see we have a lot of age assurance laws that are happening right now in places like Mississippi, Utah, places that have slightly more like social conservative bases and want kind of strictures put around access to adult sexual content. So specifically things like pornography, but are also kind of crossing over into social media land. The best types of restrictions, I think, are ones that come at the device level that allow parents to pick devices, like to buy into things like dumb phones, for example, as we call them, things that have a limited number of applications on them, not things that can be routed around and you can download other types of things, not smartphones locked down, but actual phones that have no capability to become smartphones, and that like provide things that parents want, like an ability to text their kid, an ability to geo-track their kid, an ability to kind of like have their kid be able to like look up certain types of things, but not access certain other types of social media or to decide at what point that happens. And those types of restrictions, I think, are great. Also, restrictions around kind of schools deciding not to allow phones on campuses and to lock phones in lockers or in Faraday bags or things like that during school hours. I think all of those are kind of locally based restrictions that are deeply reasonable for individuals to be making or districts or local places to be making, and give people a freedom to like move away from the district, go to a different school, make other types of accommodations, pick a different phone if you think that your kid really is like more sophisticated as a user. And so like, I just think that there's a lot of nuance that we can actually accommodate if we kind of think about these problems a little bit harder.
Okay, you mentioned the Digital Services Act, and I had actually also mentioned it earlier in the conversation, almost an hour ago at this point, about the fact that the United States, this administration, is not happy over the European Union's Digital Services Act. In fact, Trump has raised this. There are fears that he's going to put pressure on the EU in the form of higher tariffs, maybe, or something, because there's so much leverage that the United States could potentially have on Europe in order to assist these primarily U.S. big tech firms. We haven't really talked too much about the politics of that. I kind of threw that to Cam because it was, because we're talking about this because of what Australia has done. But can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the ability of big tech to put pressure on the U.S. government to then put pressure on, for example, the European Union? It sounds like you believe that things are moving forward, but it looks pretty sinister, too, in the coverage.
Oh no, I think that's a correct assessment. It is pretty sinister, and I think that it's an excellent question. It's actually where I've been spending much more of my time recently. I was in Europe for 18 months, studying the rollout of the Digital Services Act there and how this was all going to be impacted. And I left in December of last year, so about a year ago. I could not have predicted that this administration would kind of have like taken up and cared about the Digital Services Act and its enforcement in the way that it has. I mean, it's a really fascinating kind of moment from from kind of the long view in the U.S. The tech companies have been trying to get the U.S. administration of the last three presidents, including Trump one, to take up kind of the war that has been happening in Europe against tech that has required tons and tons of very costly compliance and the risk of huge levels of fines. And there has been no appetite for that, frankly, until this administration. And now this administration under Trump, the second time, has kind of, it seems, made it clear that they are willing to kind of go to bat in Europe on the at least the beard, the excuse, the whatever you want to call it, of free speech, and kind of make this argument that Europe is restricting the free speech of its citizens, which it never cared about before. And I don't understand why there's no actual jurisdictional or legal reason that like Europe doesn't have an absolute right, especially as a Western democracy, to just decide to like make its own laws around how it wants companies to conduct themselves and what speech looks like within its own borders. And so Yeah, I think that this has become very quickly a very interesting and kind of dangerous cudgel in a geopolitical kind of fight. And I never would have predicted that the DSA would have an impact on kind of whether or not the United States stayed in NATO or whether or not the United States gave support to Ukraine or anything like that. But we're seeing that kind of more and more. And JD Vance, are the chairman of the Federal Communications Center in the United States has commission, excuse me, has have all gone over to Europe and kind of made speeches to this regard and kind of talked about how restrictive the EU is. And so, yes, I think Australia is also a part of that. Australia is the latest kind of piece that that the U.S. administration is kind of turning towards Australia and pointing and saying we have a role to play, whether it's manufactured or not, or because at the big tech's behest or not, we have a role to play in pushing back against censorship around the world. And that has, that has become a really dangerous kind of tool and unforeseeable, in my opinion, how quickly it happened.
Kate, we've taken up a lot of your time. I'm going to just check in with Jared one last time to see if there's anything that you have for Kate from the audience, and if not.
I mean, we've had a couple of questions, and it's absolutely fine if you're not able to answer this, Kate. But there's some questions about, and we chatted a little bit about this earlier, but about verification and the problems of verification in this instance. Nilay's written, what about verification? Will it be through uploading a photo? And then Let's Be Real is saying there's a parallel to this in the UK with its Online Safety Act, where age verification checks are evaded by simply using a VPN.
Yeah. Yeah, and people, I mean, it depends. There's many different terminologies around age verification, just FYI. There's age gating, there's age assurance, there's age verification. Those are all different terminologies. They carry with them certain types of legal requirements about how much work the company has to do to comply with, they can range from just asking age and then taking age down and then letting kind of making a determination based on declaration alone. They can go to getting licenses and kind of asking for 2-point verification in that kind of way. They can go to using behavioral data and age assurance kind of laws, ask for companies to use to the very state of the art best practices that are available to them digitally and in terms of privacy information and data, what age the person using the service is, and make a guess. But all of these things are that is both the beauty and the dangers of the internet. Everything is you can route around everything. And so there is truly kind of the reader is completely correct. The Online Safety Act in the UK has been easily routed around by VPNs. And that was a known consequence before they passed it. Everyone knew that all of a sudden no one was going to want to be providing their driver's license to look at pornography online and use their real name, and that they were all going to be downloading VPNs. And so download rates of VPNs went through the roof. It's we laugh. I laugh with my students when I teach this to them. But this is why pass the law? And the answer is, well, performatively, it makes them look like they did something. It makes the regulators look good. They did their thing. We can't help the fact that this law is so easily routed around. But just query whether these things are worth doing and whether or not we're actually getting anything out of these laws, and that this isn't just creating an absolutely kind of ridiculous and almost comical effect to a certain extent on onerous user use of the internet, and that this is not actually getting to the things that we're the most worried about the ill harms of social media and the internet in general.
Well, Kate Klonick, thank you so much for joining us. On that note, I think that's the right way to end the conversation. We're really grateful that you were able to join us from the morning in the East Coast of the United States. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
One thing that she was saying about the fact that the EU Digital Services Act is under pressure from the United States government, and the European Union is such a powerful entity. I really wonder about the middle powers, countries such as South Africa or Indonesia or small countries like Singapore, if they want to push back against big tech and put up some guardrails, whether it's about protecting children or whether it's more general, that it's going to be really tough if the United States government decides that they are going to flex on behalf of those big tech companies. But that is, frankly, another news desk conversation.
Although it's interesting because we have had in the chat people sort of imagining how this would go down in their own countries, and some people are saying, yeah, we would love it. But Carolina, hi Carolina, one of our longtime viewers, she says if this law was proposed in the Philippines, that a massive backlash could occur. So yeah, lots of different views on how it would go down in people's own home countries.
For sure. Well, I think that means it's time to go to the poll and see what people think.
Poll results. Let me repeat our poll question. Will Australia's social media ban work? We've got 92 votes. 45% says yes, it's a good first step. 25% says maybe, but kids will get around it. 23% thinks it's pointless, and 7% thinks no, tech firms will sabotage it.
Oh, very interesting. So the greatest number of people do actually support this
ban, yeah.
And possibly even further, if they're saying it's a good first step, that sort of implies that there could be, as you were saying also, further legislation, further measures, whatever the case may be. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and I think it kind of reflects like people's frustrations with social media. We all know some of the problems with it, even if the research is really hard to sort of figure out and sort of separate from the other problems in our lives. But people do seem to know that doom scrolling exists and wasting time on it exists, and that it does impact our mental health. And
talking about doom scrolling, actually, there's one comment that I think is really interesting to mention. Someone is saying that it's almost impossible to fight against big tech company, which is designing these apps to make you addicted to it, to make you doom scroll, to make you look at it nonstop. And yeah, I think it's worth mentioning because I personally have the same opinion.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I spend a lot of time on Instagram.
Yeah, I think we all do.
All right.
Sometimes you think they should take it away from me, but anyway, that's another conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Sorry, I interrupted you just now, Jared. But we hope you learned a thing or two.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a really lively conversation. And as ever, we will put up next week's topic on Tuesday, so a day before the next news desk starts. We don't know what the topic is yet. A week is a long time. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 7 days, but it's going to be, as ever, interesting and exciting. And we look forward to your company next week. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.